Everyone, delighted to be having a returning chat with author and educator Trevor Bryan. Trevor, thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I think you and I share a love of the visual media, I guess I should say. A love of teaching, reading, art, a variety of connections here. And I know that you have written about visuals and comprehension. On this episode, we're talking about a new project of yours called Narrative Know-How.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I think, stories, whether you're a visual artist or a writer, stories are just so ingrained in the human experience, right? Whether they're movies or plays or however they're told. So I've enjoyed stories my whole life, and I enjoy, exploring them and trying to figure out ways to help kids connect to the stories I love, and hopefully introduce them to stories they love.
Yeah, yeah. What is it about story that you feel like matters and makes story such an ingrained and important part of human experience?
Well, I think, my understanding of stories is they've been around for tens of thousands of years, and they really are a way of helping people explain, everyday phenomena, um, to pass on lessons to people, to pass on lessons through generations. Um, so I think they give us a way into the human experience that's entertaining to us, that attracts our brain, right? Our brains respond to stories. So I think they're good not just for entertainment purposes. I think they're good for passing on lessons and learning lessons, really delving into the emotional experience of being human. And I think stories and artists who work on stories really kind of delve into those things directly in a way, right? And manage those and express them and explore them in a way that helps just people understand a little bit more about their lives and about the experiences they're going through.
The study of story is so deep and so rich, and I know that as part of the book, you're focused on the structure and story structure, the architecture. I'm thinking about Com DeFalco. He was on an episode with me and said that there are three important parts of writing: structure, structure, and structure. Uh, why do you think story structure is so important for readers to understand?
Yeah, so I think if we're right when we're talking about comprehension in particular, right? So the book Narrative Know-How is largely driven by the idea of helping kids to comprehend, just like my first book, The Art of Comprehension. Um, right, was designed around comprehension, and it's making meaning of the story and helping kids to efficiently make meaning of the story in an academic manner. Um, and so text structure, what I kind of have realized through this work is that I kind of think of it like one of the analogies I give is auto mechanics, and how when what allows an mechanic to kind of tackle any engine for the most part is their understanding of how an engine works. And right, they start with very basic engines, and from very basic engines they can go into more complicated engines, but generally they know all the parts of the engine. They know how all the parts of the engine relate to each other. And so therefore, if they can look at, if they only work on Hondas or something and then switch to a Ford, right, those engines are still going to have a lot of similarities, and they can navigate that engine, right? Even though they might be a little unfamiliar with it, it helps them to navigate it. And then in that sense, if you think of reading as, or reading comprehension basically as solving problems, right? Answering questions and solving problems, right? Just like the mechanic, if they kind of know how an engine works, there's going to be certain things that they pick up on, and certain patterns even as to why this engine might not be working, in order to fix the engine and solve it. I think that's largely true with stories, is that stories really pretty much operate the same way, regardless of whether it's a short story or a long story. There might be more scenes, but scenes operate the same way. All right, chapters operate pretty much the same way. There's a structure to them. And once kids kind of recognize that structure and can pick up on it, it helps them to kind of think about what might be ahead, but it also just helps them to organize it, right? To summarize, or organize the information so that they can respond to questions. But it also indicates to them whether they're tracking the story, whether they're right, as a comprehension check. If it's not really making sense, right, or if this isn't matching what they think is going to happen, it gives them some cue as to, to delve a little bit deeper or reread or whatever it is.
Yeah, yeah. And we also have the arts and comics connection, so I'm curious what you would offer with that in terms of comprehension. What does drawing, what do comics and these visual elements help get across in storytelling?
Yeah, well, I think so. I always think that illustrations are right. They're telling the same story, just in a different symbol system, right? So writing, that the character had a frown is the same information as drawing a character with a frown, right? It's the same information, just portrayed differently. So I think largely in my mind, especially working in the school, we're not really dealing with much different information. It's about collecting the information, noticing the information, organizing the information, and then being able to use that information to explain your thinking, right? Or adding your thinking. And I think it's, really similar, whether it's a picture or whether it's written words. What we're asking kids to do is the same work. I think illustrations and graphic novels and stuff offer a way for kids to really do that, and sometimes in a more comfortable medium where it's not as stressful as looking at a word, a page of words. I also think, right, movies, animated movies, plays. I always kind of talk about the idea that if an English class reads a play, it's considered academic work. But if the theater club spends 6 months doing a play, performing a play, working out the scenes, talking about how they're going to show it, how they're going to play it, what the emotion of the scene needs to be, what the lighting needs to be, and all this stuff, somehow that's not academic. And I would sort of argue that's a very close read of the play.
Mhm.
And so we sometimes, for whatever reason, just dismiss some of the arts. I'm not really sure why, but that's kind of like a knee-jerk reaction, when in fact, a lot of the arts are really, when it comes to movies, comic books, graphic novels, plays, it's just really good storytelling done just, not with a focus on the words.
Yeah, yeah. If I may tuck a question here, I always like to ask about process. So, as someone who speaks, who shares information, who writes and conveys information that way, are arts and visuals also part of your process?
Sometimes I'm not as good as, I'm not a natural illustrator, so I don't have that skill. I actually find writing a lot easier, but I draw tremendously off of my visual background. Um, I do like, and this is the part that I wish I was better at. I do like to try and organize information into small graphics, kind of like back of the napkin type stuff. Like, right, I
Mhm.
really appreciate those simple graphs and those simples, those right, just a few words that kind of lay out a point nicely with maybe a few arrows or boxes or whatever. So a lot of times when I am stuck, not that I necessarily use those graphics that I produce, but that is definitely a way that I try and problem solve and think my way through some of the complex ideas. I just try and organize it in a simpler manner. And I don't always succeed with it, but just the process of trying to get that down simply kind of gives me a foundation that helps with the writing.
Yeah, yeah. This is kind of a takeoff of the question that you've shared with me, which is the Beetlejuice question, the qualifications. So I think you're in an agreeing space here as far as linking arts and literacy. But if someone were to be skeptical and they were to say, well, what are the qualifications? How is art part of literacy? Is there anything that you might offer to such a skeptic?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we kind of touched upon it a little bit before. Like, comic books come alive with the illustrations, right? I'm, I've done some work with Peter Reynolds, who is probably known more as an illustrator than a writer, perhaps, but his books have sold millions of copies. Right? He's a storyteller, and he tells stuff, and his books. In particular, rely on both the pictures and the words to tell the story. I would argue that the pictures, in some ways, tell more of the story. But from stained glass windows in churches to animators in movies to actors, right? The stories have always been told visually. So for me, it's not a big leap to kind of think about how written stories operate, versus all the visual stories that I've taken in. And again, when you go back to the structure of them, the structure of stories, whether they're visual or written, are identical in most cases. And so giving kids that foundational understanding of how a story works, I think really sets them up for the academic that they have to do around story.
Yeah. You make the distinction between comprehension and demonstrating comprehension. Anything that you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, so I think, like the way that if we put down a Scooby Doo episode, if we had a bunch of kindergartners watch a Scooby Doo episode, or first graders or second graders, my sense is that most of them would not be lost in terms of what's happening in the story. That they would have absolutely no clue, and you would have to, right? You don't have to, if you go to a movie with a small child, you don't have to, stop every 2 minutes to explain to them what's happening, right? I think inherently we pretty much understand comprehension. I think where we get stuck a little bit is once we get into a school environment and we have to demonstrate that comprehension, where kids have to answer certain questions or write a certain way. That's where I think a lot of kids get stuck. So what I try and do in my books, The Art of Comprehension, and then a little bit more, even more explicitly in Narrative Know-How, is really think about, okay, what pieces do the kids need in order to answer these questions well, in order to demonstrate their comprehension. And I think focusing on those small bits of information and starting with that information, is going to help kids to demonstrate their comprehension a little bit more strongly. But I think sometimes we just think about comprehension as understanding, and I really don't think that it's necessarily always an understanding issue. I think it's an understanding of how to demonstrate that understanding. And I think if we approach instruction that way a little bit more, it kind of gives us a different lens in which to think about it.
Yeah, yeah, very well said. Very well said. Well, I think I have one official final question, and then we can touch on anything that we've missed. Websites, online spaces, in-person spaces, anything like that that you'd like to share for people to connect and check out the materials that you're creating.
Sure. So I'm getting a web page up shortly. Just Trevor Bryan Literacy. I have a Facebook page, Trevor Bryan Literacy, and Instagram, Trevor Bryan Literacy. I'm also, my personal and literacy pages are pretty enmeshed, though. I have a lot of educators that
Hmm.
I am friends with and that we follow on, just Trevor Bryan. So Facebook and Instagram are where I'm most active. But so you can find me there on any of those.
Great, great. Yeah, anything that you want to make sure to include before we close out of the interview?
I think we covered a good chunk. I think the only thing, Narrative Know-How in the book also really explores the link between reading and writing, and so that
Mm.
text structure idea not only really benefits kids in reading, right? When they understand how a story works, it helps them to comprehend it, right? It helps them to go on that journey. But it also, once they understand text, story structure, having a sound understanding of story structures really helps them to craft stories that work, right? And I think one of the big problems with teaching kids to write is that they tend to write these stories without any structure, and they just sort of go on, and then, and it doesn't really go anywhere. And once they lock into a structure, then they're working. You're going to have something that works well, and it's a lot easier to practice the traditional craft moves of writing when you have a workable story. So that's the other part that the book really delves into, which I think will be very helpful for a lot of educators.
Awesome, awesome. Well, Trevor, always delighted to talk about literacy, comprehension, visuals, arts, all the things, and certainly glad to have you back anytime. Wishing you well with this project and all of the projects that are on the way.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.